This is Antic, the Atari BBS podcast.
Biggest problem we had, of course, was with the cassette tapes. In the early days, losing data. Found huge dropouts in the data stream, looking at the data signal through an oscilloscope. But we never found out exactly why, and that technology went away really quick. Well, I took a 300 baud acoustic modem and a Mr. microphone on one computer, and a stereo and a 300 baud acoustic modem on another, and we would send files from one corner of the garage to the other using FM frequencies over the airwaves.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Bob Stahl worked in the Atari home computer division, where he was the senior technician in the receiving inspection department, doing first article inspection. He explains what that means in the interview. Then he moved on to software quality engineering, testing produced software to make sure it looked and worked correctly. Later, he was hired by Atari's coin-op division to do receiving inspection for that company. He also ran an Atari BBS called Modem Magazine. In this interview, we discuss Cassie Mass, whom I previously interviewed. This interview took place on November 1st, 2015. So I'm coming into this interview cold. All I know is that you used to be married to Cassie and that you worked in the computer division, and that's all she gave me, and that was good enough. So what was your job when you were working at Atari?
I started with the Atari Home Computer Division, the HCD group, on the day that it separated from the VCS group. It was a Monday morning. It was the first day that they were on their own after they separated and moved into new office space and new building space. I was the only senior mechanical technician in the receiving inspection department. I did all of the first article inspections. First article inspection is when purchasing wants to buy a new part. They ask the supplier to provide them with, 50 or 100 parts. I got 10 of them, inspected them, make sure they met the criteria the engineers set out. And if the parts were okay, then they were approved for production, and then we would buy parts from that supplier. Cool. To build our.
All right. So let's go back. How did you get hired by Atari at the very beginning? What year was it, and what were you hired for?
Well, that was the early 80s. I'm not sure exactly what year it was. It was the early 80s. And I was doing quality control inspection at various companies around the Bay Area. I was working a lot of temporary work. I liked the temporary work because it was always new, and it wasn't real long term. You'd work 6 months or 4 months at a place and then get to go to a new place and learn new stuff and see new stuff. And when Cassie went in for her orientation, when she started working there, she saw a guy with a pair of calipers on his T-shirt, and she mentioned something to him, and he said he was the supervisor for receiving inspection. And she told him that her husband worked in inspection and ran coordinate measuring machines and stuff, and he was, oh man, we need somebody to run our new coordinate measuring machine. And so I got set up with him and talked to him, and he said, okay, you're hired. I called personnel. He said, get a hold of personnel, tell them you're going to start working, blah, blah, blah. I called personnel. Personnel didn't know what to do. No one gets hired by the supervisor. They always come through personnel first. Well, I kind of went around personnel and got hired. It was a great job. I loved the company. It was so much fun.
Literally, your first day was the day that the computer group split off from the video game department?
That was my first day.
Nice.
Was the day that they started. Then the coordinate measuring machine hadn't even come yet. And I show up for my first day at work, and they say, okay, your coordinate measuring machine's going to sit right here on the floor. There's your desk. Find something to do until your machine gets here. A couple of days later, a guy from the receiving dock come in and said, "Hey, your machine's here. Come and get it off the truck." Nobody wanted to touch it. So I got to drive the forklift and pick the machine up off the truck and put it on the floor and get it all up and running. Back then, they were, state-of-the-art computerized measuring machines.
And what did they measure? What were you? What did this thing do?
It was a point-to-point measuring machine. It had a bunch of, pretty sophisticated software in there that would measure circles and lines and distances. And you would, back then you would tell it, give it a command to measure a line, and it would measure a line along the edge of something. It had different hard probes. It had hard probes to measure line surfaces. It had pointy probes and round probes to measure in holes. And it basically was it had like a VisiCalc underneath it, or a spreadsheet underneath it, and it put all those numbers in there, and it would create a wireframe in memory, a 3D wireframe of the object that you were measuring, and then it would tell you what all the sizes were and all the dimensions were.
So what kind of stuff were you measuring? Circuit boards?
I measured everything from the PC boards to the plastic cases to, the early machines had metal castings in them that the electronics was in to shield the EMF.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big part of, the early machines, was those big metal castings. The machine was kind of built around it, and they were a main part of the machine that gave it a lot of strength and rigidity and force. They made it heavy.
Mm-hmm.
Apple was painting the inside of their plastic with some kind of paint that controlled the EMF, and we were using a metal cage to contain the EMF. So I measured everything that went through there.
Huh. So you had, I assume you had like a specs, okay, this casing is supposed to be X millimeters thick, and then you run it through the machine and make sure that the test samples actually were what they were to spec.
Well, everything was made to blueprints. The engineers originally, designed the machine and the blueprints, and then the blueprint would be given to a die house, a casting house that would make a die casting. And they made a die casting, and they casted, 50 parts or whatever, and they sent them over to us, and we would inspect them and make sure that they met the requirements of the engineering drawings, all the blueprints, and it all went from there. If there were any errors or changes or differences in the parts, a lot of times the blueprints would get, the dimension would get changed a little bit, as long as they screwed together and the holes were close enough to line up with the mating parts, then everything was good to go. But yeah, everything was very well specified and dictated out, even the electronic components. If you wanted a 7412 LS chip, you had to buy it from a specific manufacturer because those manufacturers' parts were tested in the circuit and proven to be fine and to work. And if purchasing would buy a part from somebody that wasn't on the approved vendors list, it always created a little bit of a problem and a holdup because, well, you can't have these for manufacturing because they're not on the approved list. Until engineering puts one in a machine and makes sure that it works and they approve it, I can't accept it. So, yeah, everything was on an approved vendors list. Everybody had to be approved that they could make the parts that actually worked and met all of the specifications and requirements.
Can you think of an example? Tell me a story about a time when things weren't to spec and you got to hold things up, or...
I can tell you about a time a guy tried to put a 25,000 square pin in a 25,000 diameter round hole. Of course, it didn't fit. And it created a little bit of a problem, and we had to come up with a solution, of course. We ended up drilling bigger holes in the next set of PC boards so that it would fit better. We pushed those ones down through the board. It shaved a little material off, but it was okay. It just created a little problem and a backup in, manufacturing. It took them a few extra seconds or minutes to, get the thing down in there. But other than that, it went pretty smooth. Pretty smooth. The vendors in the Bay Area, a lot of the stuff came right from the Bay Area, and they were pretty good vendors. They knew what they were doing. If you asked them for a part that was 1 inch square, they gave you a part that was 1 inch square. So there wasn't a whole lot of problems there. A lot of it was just, constant flow, just in time receiving. We're going to build 1,000 computers tomorrow. We need 1,000 parts today. Mm-hmm. To get them to the floor. So it was a constant, ongoing thing. We had in receiving inspection at HCD, I'll bet you, I never really counted them and took exact count, but I'll bet there was 20 of us in there. It was no small lab. Some of the people specialized in PC boards, others in components, others in, metal and plastic, and kind of, the inspectors would learn to specialize. If they had any problems or questions, they always came to see me first. I was the senior tech. I taught the training classes and showed people how to measure stuff, and wrote the training manual for the optical comparator, and taught, we had little classes internally where we would, everybody there would learn how to use a pair of calipers. All of that, of course, is for the quality requirements. Back then, Duran on quality was the big thing, and we wanted high-quality products. Most of them were. The biggest problem we had, of course, was with the cassette tapes. In the early days, losing data. And I did a bunch of research and background into that and found huge dropouts in the data stream, looking at the status signal through an oscilloscope. But we never found out exactly why. And, that technology went away really quick, so we were on to, floppy drives and things like that. So that was a problem. That was more of a problem, actually, for Cassie and her customer support group. They got the calls from everybody saying, hey, this doesn't work. This doesn't work right, or it only works sometimes, or whatever. And she would have them send in their cassette tapes, and she would give them to me, and we would give them a new one, and I would look at their cassette tape to see if I could figure out why it wouldn't load, and make sure that the program didn't load off of the cassette, or whatever they were complaining about. Sometimes, of course, it was user error. Sometimes it was bad data.
Yeah. I recently did a project that we received a large batch of very rare Atari cassette tapes, and we digitized them all, and then I had a friend who painstakingly adjusted everything in Audacity so that the audio levels were good. And on some of the tapes, he would spend just hours just hand tweaking things in a way, of course, you couldn't do in 1980, to make these tapes work. And the quality certainly was varied widely on the cassette tapes.
Yeah, well, I think Commodore had a cassette player for their little 64 too, mm-hmm. And as far as I know, none of them really worked that well. It really just wasn't a good enough media to store data. Whether it wasn't turning fast enough or what, we never knew. But, they were just standard cassette players that were modified a little bit from playing music to reading data. So they were nothing special. It didn't even have 3 speeds on them like an old turntable used to have.
Right.
The old reel-to-reel tapes had 2 or 3 speeds on them, and you could run them really fast and get 2 hours of recording on this big tape, but it was a lot better recording than if you ran it really slow and packed 8 hours onto it. But, did a lot of research into that and never really came up with an answer. And like I said, the technology went away, so we went on to bigger and better things.
So with your fancy machine, were you mostly in charge of measurements, or were you ever in charge of, I don't know, like, say, color? Like, the color of this plastic's not up to spec. It's not the right shade of gray or, beige or whatever. Or was that someone else?
Well, we had color chips. In fact, we even had a color class one time, explaining the differences in shades to people. and picking out, of these three colors, which two are the same and which one's a little bit different. And, we went through all of that. We had Color Master chips that when a load of top covers would come in, we would compare the color plastic chip with the top covers and make sure that they were the same. The Cycolac, it was called Cycolac material, the stuff that it was actually molded with, and it comes from, DuPont or 3M or somebody, and they're really good at what they do. And you know what? We never had to reject a lot of parts because the colors were off. So they had their formula and their mixing of the pellets pretty good. That really wasn't a problem. The biggest problem that you had with plastic parts when you have a high standoff that's 2 inches or 3 inches from the surface, they can tweak a little bit off to the side, so it wasn't right where you wanted it. If they're taken out of the mold too soon, they're hot when they're taken out of the mold. Sometimes they might bend a little bit before they harden up. They're soft when they get taken out of the mold, or they can be if they're not done correctly. So the plastic was really never a problem. We liked the green stuff. It was pretty good. And then with the new products, the XL products, we went to a white plastic, and of course, no problems with that whatsoever because there was no mixing of colors. But I did all the first articles for Taiwan when they went into production for the XL series also, and got them all set up. Now that machine had a sheet metal cage that went around the electronics to hold in the EMF rather than a casting. So it was a cost reduction, price reduction to the customers, and it still served the same purpose, made the machines a little bit lighter, but it was the same sort of thing. Of course, sheet metal is a little bit more of a problem than castings. Castings are pretty much all the same. Sheet metal can vary because it's so thin. If it gets dropped or treated severely, it can bend a little bit. But we approved all of their parts, and they got up in productions, and they started running, and everything turned white towards the end. And then finally when production went away, they moved me into software quality engineering, and I did all of the foreign language tapes. Like I said, I was into the cassette tape thing. I had the foreign language tapes that were my product, and basically what you did as a software quality engineer was, you looked at the boxes and made sure that the color in the artworks was consistent and the same each time, and you tested a couple cassettes and make sure that they were recorded correctly, and kept track of the vendors and complaints from, customer service and things like that.
So when you say foreign language tapes, do you mean the ones that were printed in other languages, or do you mean like the tapes that taught languages?
Teaching. Yeah, they were teaching cassettes, and we had one in Spanish, Italian, German,
French. Yeah, okay.
French.
So like conversational French or whatever. That's you're in charge of those. I see.
Yeah, right.
All right.
And so I got to sit at work and learn French. I don't know any of it today, but I'd go through them. A couple times a week. I'd go through one and make sure that it was working the way that I thought it should work.
Nice. And did it always? I mean, what happened when it didn't? Did you have to throw away the whole batch, or just you're spot checking?
Actually, most of that stuff worked fine. The amount of rejects was too low to actually catch at receiving inspection. And that's where, my connection with customer service and the fact that my wife worked in a different building, 10 miles away, but she was in customer service, and that we, of course, knew each other and talked all the time.
Right.
I got a lot of feedback that I probably or may not have gotten had that not have happened. So whenever she had any problems or would bring things up, I'd always tell her, well, get me one. Let me see it.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if we can't figure it out. But surprisingly enough, everyone thought that the reject rates weren't high enough to actually get too awfully concerned about. Of course, there's always problems with everything. It's mass-produced. So you sent them a new one, and that usually made them happy. And if I got my hands on the old one, I would see if I could figure out what was wrong. But we had pretty good luck. Not much stuff got returned to the manufacturer from us. Some stuff would get held up and go to material review board, and the engineers would decide if it would be okay or not to use, and it usually was. So that part of the business was pretty cut and dry, pretty standard in the industry, actually, with receiving inspection and quality levels and things like that. They had a big quality program. They had, quite a few guys working in quality to keep things running smoothly, and as far as I know, it pretty much did. The guys on the line would turn their screwdrivers up to full power and twist screws off every once in a while or strip a hole. So they bought me a fancy gauge, and once a week I'd go down the assembly line and adjust all of the torque tools, the air drive tools, back down to the 30 psi or whatever they were supposed to run. I know that they turned them right back up as soon as I left. If they weren't careful and they were new on the job, if that was the first day maybe they were putting the screws in, they would strip a few out. Those parts always got, thrown to the side. If the screws won't hold it together, you can't sell it. So, and it's funny, the littlest things can cause the biggest problems.
Such as screws?
Well, the screws stripping out.
Right.
Because the guy putting the screw in thinks that it takes too long to put the screw in. There ain't enough power. I need more power.
Right.
And he'd go do something, and somebody else would put a few screws in, and the next thing you know, they didn't understand, the subtlety of putting screws in. I don't know if you've ever used a big screwdriver and put drywall screws in, but it's kind of the same thing. You can certainly strip them out with a powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But I didn't really spend much time in the assembly area. That was a different building, of course, around the corner. And the parts would come into receiving inspection in big lots and boxes. And we would get a sample from the warehouse and approve it or reject it. And then the warehouse would move it over to staging for the assembly floor. So that was in a different building, which, wouldn't have hurt to have it in the same building, but there wasn't a building that big around at the time. So we needed a couple warehouses. I forget. I mean, I'm sure that if you've done research on Atari, they had dozens and dozens of buildings.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. We had people spread out all over the Bay Area.
All right, so you're working there in software quality engineering, and you're testing cassette tapes, and then what happened?
Well, then pretty much everything went away when Jack Tramiel, I guess, from Commodore bought the place. He moved most everything. Everything got, big shakeup, and back then they used to have RIFs, they called them. They were reduction in forces for companies. And when you got, 10,000 employees and you're not building computers anymore, you only need 5,000. 5,000 got to go. So then those days were over. That was the end of one of the best jobs I ever had in my life.
Yeah?
Yep, truly loved it there.
What made it such a great job?
The atmosphere and the people, we all loved, we loved our little Atari computers. It was, state of the art, on the bleeding edge of technology. Everybody was happy to come to work every day. Everybody loved their jobs. It was a really great atmosphere where, people would listen to your ideas, might not always do anything about it, but they would certainly listen to your ideas. And the good stuff got bumped to the top, and sometimes things would happen. And then a year or so after that, then I actually went to work over at the Atari, the original Atari, that built the video games for like the restaurants and bars and arcade games. So I worked there for quite a while until Bally bought a big chunk of that and started moving that out of the Bay Area, and they moved it back east, I guess. Yeah, out of the three divisions of Atari, the VCS, the HCD, and the coin-op, I worked at the HCD and the coin-op.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So were you doing more QC in the coin-op department?
Receiving inspection, I was the only receiving inspector, and I saw every part that went into every video game that we loaded on a truck and shipped somewhere.
Wow.
Once again, great job, great people, great atmosphere, lots of fun, lots of video games to play. Always the newest one.
Sure. Were the problems and things they had to deal with in the arcade department any different? It's just more of the same stuff, measuring things and.
Yeah, more of the same stuff. You know, we didn't need a computerized coordinate measuring system, so we didn't really have one of those. The cabinets would come in already put together, so it wasn't like you were measuring pieces of wood to make sure that they would fit together. Basically, you were checking, I thought one of the most important things was the wiring harnesses. You know, they were pretty complicated, like a wiring harness for in a car. Hundreds of wires, hundreds of connectors. Everything had to be right, or it certainly wouldn't work. So I spent a lot of time on wiring harnesses and wiring. A lot of the other stuff came in as assemblies, and we had, fixtures and jigs and test stands to put things in to test them. All of the PC boards were built and tested on a test stand for at least, I think, 24 hours. They were burned in before they went into a game to make sure that they would not fail. A lot of electronic stuff fails the first time you turn it on or you plug it in. And if it doesn't fail when you first plug it in, it may last for 100 years. So the initial testing and the burn-in we thought was pretty critical. So we spent a lot of time on that sort of stuff. But everything went together pretty good, and we had the assembly floor right there, so if there were any problems, the assemblers would get a hold of their boss right away, and we would get to the bottom of it and find a solution.
What haven't I asked you that I should have?
I don't know. That really, covers at least 90% of it.
Well, tell me a story about the other 10%. About someone interesting you worked with, or an interesting problem you had, or something that springs to mind.
Well, way back in the day, we tried to open a little computer school, and we taught basic programming, assembly language, and word processing, computer use. And we had it set up in our garage. We had a big fancy garage there in San Jose, and we set up a little computer school. We called it the Computer Literacy Institute.
This is you and Cassie?
CLI.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of the guys from Atari, Alan Noy was his name. He taught the basic class. He was a basic programmer. He wrote some of the code in the programs for our receiving inspection department software. To connect it to the Madman system and to integrate stuff. So we got him to teach the basic class. So we got Nick Turner, who was involved in the Breakout project. He was one of the programmers in the Breakout and Super Breakout, and I think Snoopy and the Red Baron. And he was assembly language, so he taught assembly language programming. And we actually had a couple people come through the school that learned assembly language and ended up getting jobs at Electronic Arts because they knew assembly programming. So that was pretty cool. We had I had a stereo sitting in one side of the garage, a little corner, and I bought a Mr. Microphone. Remember Mr. Microphone?
Sure, yeah.
He would you talk in Mr. Microphone and tune your FM stereo around 100. And you could hear it over the speakers. Well, I took a 300-baud acoustic modem and a Mr. Microphone on one computer and a stereo and a 300-baud acoustic modem on another, and we would send files from one corner of the garage to the other using FM frequencies over the airwaves. And this was back in the early 80s.
Nice.
We ran a bulletin board called Modem Magazine. We ran a bulletin board, Cassie and I, for years and years and years, and had thousands of callers, some from all over the world. Got calls from Australia, got calls from Europe. Had lots of stuff on there.
Was this running on an Atari?
Yep, running on Ataris.
Nice.
Running on Ataris, and, one of the engineers came up with a switching device that would switch just little toggle switches through the joystick ports. And we were making all kinds of stuff and switching stuff through the joystick ports. So because of the limitations of the computers back then, I actually had two computers, and I had one hooked up to answer the phone and connect you, and if you wanted to do some other stuff, then the switches would act, and it would disconnect you from one computer and actually connect the wires, hard wires, right over to the other computer, so that you were on, a different computer. Of course, the users never knew that, but...
Well, that's pretty amazing.
Those were some of the things that we were playing with back then. We had an ATR 8000 hooked up to some big 8-inch disk drives. I had a 5-megabyte Corvus for a while, and then I met some guys at Corvus and had them rebuild it into 20 megabytes for me. And we worked with, God, and now you're making me remember names. David Small, I think, was his name.
Uh-huh.
And he made ROM boards for the 800. And the ROM board would access the Corvus hard disk drive. So, of course, I had to have some of them ROM boards and access that Corvus hard disk drive. And, of course, 20 megabytes, you couldn't fill it back then. The programs were too small.
Sure.
But we had every available free Atari download that was, public domain.
I just found an article here while you were talking in InfoWorld magazine. It's called Addicted to Information. Bulletin boards, databases can be more than habit forming. And there's a beautiful picture of you and Cassie and Modem Magazine, all the hardware.
Yep, that was one of our more exciting, get a little bit of attention. And then,
nice.
And in one year at Christmas, my friend Jeff Bell, who you probably already interviewed, or if you didn't, you should.
I should, yeah.
He was one of the longest employees at Atari. He was hired by Nolan Bushnell, worked in Nolan Bushnell's garage when they were just building, video games. And the first Pong game. And Jeff had a young boy, and at Christmas time, we're going to set up bulletin boards so that kids can send their letter to Santa electronically.
Oh, neat.
So we created a Santa line, it was called. And one of the news people in Oakland, I think, found out about it, and they came out and did a news story and had us on the evening news for 2 or 3 minutes one winter.
Nice.
So we got a little attention there. I had a small program published in the Antic magazine. I think it was about the same month or the same quarter as the InfoWorld article came out. And it was how to make a banner using the little 4-color plotter that they came out with.
Mm-hmm.
With the new XL series, they had a little 4-color ink pen plotter. And it was just a simple little program that would print a Happy Birthday Billy banner. Of course, there was no software available for that printer when it first came out. I was one of the first ones to touch one. And so I wrote a program, and Antic Magazine liked it, so they spread it around the world.
Nice. I don't see that. I'm looking at Antic, and I searched for Stahl. I found out some articles by Cassie, but I don't see yours.
It would be, it had a black cover on it, and 3 or 4 guys standing on the cover, and it was in the article about the 1020 plotter printer. It was part of that little article that Cassie did.
Oh, I see.
A review on that article. And then another guy wrote a little program to do spirograph.
Right.
His program and my program.
Which is what a plotter is best at, really. Spirograph.
Yeah, but, he already did that, so I had to do something different.
Right. Nice.
And I figured, everybody loves to print banners. Everybody printed banners back then. That was one of the things to do. So a lot of experience in the old, phone lines. The phone company, someone would get a new phone on the street, and all of a sudden my computer wouldn't work, and I'd call the phone company and tell them exactly what happened and where to go. And put the wires back the way they were. You can't use those wires. So I got to know the phone guys pretty well. And that was one of the real challenges, was keeping the phone line up and running consistently. I'm not sure exactly why, but back then, evidently, data wasn't, phone lines weren't really designed for that. So if they moved a couple wires around, you could still use voice calls, but you couldn't do the data thing.
How many lines did you have?
Oh, I think at one time I had 2. But, way back before the internet, you could only have one person online at a time. And we really never figured out how to have more than one person online at a time, although we tried with those switches too, but you couldn't really synchronize the data the way that they do now with packets and stuff. So, the technology has certainly come a long way. I mean, I remember wanting and rubbing our hands together waiting for the first machine that would do 1 MIP, When the 486 33s came out, oh, man, we all had to have one of those. And then next thing you know, they got 66s, they doubled it. And, oh, man, got to have one of those. I forget, the first 2400 baud modem I got cost $1,500.
Oh.
It was just outrageous. And I don't think I connected one caller at 2400 baud because nobody else had one.
Right.
But they would connect at 1200 after a while. We went from 300 to 1200. And that helped speed things up. But typically, I think back then we put a limit of 20 minutes per user. So if you were lucky enough to get the line, you could be on there for 20 minutes, and then it would tell you it was time for you to go, and the next person could get online. And that phone rang 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was someone online almost always.
Wow. So what was the focus of your BBS? Why were people calling in?
Well, we had the downloads, and we had the messages, and Modem Magazine, I would plagiarize articles. And put them up there, things that I thought were interesting. I was, trying to do sort of an electronic magazine sort of thing, and concentrated on that. Sometimes I would, do the words to a song, a couple songs that I thought were meaningful or something like that. I would put the words up there for them, and I guess it was YouTube before the time.
See, well, that was interesting. That came out of nowhere. It said, tell me a story, and there was a whole BBS I didn't know about. That's awesome.
Yeah, Nick Turner, I think, was in that same magazine.
Yes.
I think Nick had a couple paragraphs in there, and Cassie and I had a couple paragraphs in there. And Nick, of course, like I said, was a good friend of ours and a partner in the little computer school.
I tried to get an interview with him, and I don't think it's going to pan out. He says he doesn't remember much from back in those days. I should ask him again. And in answer to your question, Jeff Bell and I am scheduled to talk to him next weekend. So.
Yeah, good kid, good guy. He knows Atari. He was in a place. He was the guy who kept track of the approved vendors list. He was the only one that had authority to add or remove anyone from the approved vendors list. So he was liaison between manufacturing and engineering, big time. His first approved vendors list was on a Wang word processor, and he did something and turned it into a spreadsheet, more or less. But he can tell you all about that. I really don't know a whole lot about that, but I know what he did, and it was pretty incredible. And he was, like I said, he got hired in Nolan Bushnell's garage, and he was like one of the last ones to close the door because he handled the computer systems. So everybody needed a computer until the last day of work. So he was the guy that locked the door the last time, probably.
So how did when did your BBS come to an end?
I really don't remember exactly. The good times were from the 1980s to 1985, and I think everything, pretty much came crashing down about 1985. I took the board offline and don't know exactly what happened to all that stuff anymore. A lot of it, I would give to other people that worked at Atari and that liked computers and did stuff. I'd say, hey, I'm getting rid of this. You want it? And we traded a lot of stuff, the guys that worked there.
And how did your time at the in the coin-op division come to an end?
Well, that came to an end when coin-op started to go down, and it was being bought out and divvied up. I guess that they, did some things, and of course I wasn't really privy to and didn't know, but the name went one place and the products went someplace else, and it kind of got bought up and parted out, the business. And when the manufacturing stopped in the Bay Area, then they didn't need manufacturing people anymore. And Jeff can tell you more about that. He'll tell you where they were building them at the end. I think that they were building them back in Chicago at Bally. And when all of the production got shifted there, then all of the manufacturing people were let go. He stayed because they still had marketing and they still had some programming engineers developing games and stuff. So, of course, he was there for another couple of years, shutting it down. But once again, great job, great people, good atmosphere. The only place I ever worked at had a nice big party at least once a summer. We'd have a party outside, and they would supply free food and kegs of beer and volleyball net. And we made 100-watt jukeboxes for Sebring, and we'd all bring our CDs from home and put them in the jukebox and bring it out to the volleyball court and play jukebox and volleyball and have pizza and beer. And then shut the place down. Shut it down at noon. Everybody come to the party. They took us to, the movies, all the movies that we helped do, Superman movie, all the movies back then. They would bring a big bus in and load a bunch of us on a bus at a time and take us to the movie theater in the middle of the day and let us see the movie that's Superman. And when I watch Superman now, the very first one, and I see him flying through the canyon, and I look at our graphics, and I have, hey, man, that was kind of state of the art back then, buddy.
Yeah, it was.
It was state of the art back then. Looks kind of hokey today, but.
If you could send a message to the people who used Atari computers back in the day and are still doing that, listening to this podcast, what would you tell them?
I loved my Atari computers. I don't have any anymore. All that stuff's been ported over now to other, to the PC format. But that was the heyday. They were great machines at the time. They were as good a machine, I think, as the Apples were, as far as the machine goes and the software. I think it was every bit as good as the Apple II.
No, it was better. It was better than the Apple II, Bob.
Well, it could have been, It certainly could have been. I don't want to, bad talk it, but it was every bit as good as the Apple IIs that I saw. And of course, back then we were into Apples II. We bought one of the very first Macintoshes, Cassie and I, at the very first Mac Fair Exposition in San Francisco, and carried it home on public transit.
Wow.
Had to have one, even though you couldn't do anything with it. No, you need an external disk drive. Your switching them floppy disks back and forth all the time. But, give me a couple of weeks. I'll have an external drive. I'll dig one up somewhere. There ain't nothing out there. There's a waiting list to buy them. Well, I'll get one somewhere. And we got a hold of one, and we loved our Macintosh. The look on the people's faces the day they saw me tear it apart and start cutting the memory chips off the board was priceless.
Why did you do that?
Well, back then they were 128K when they were brand new, and then 512K. And in order to do that, since the memory chips were actually soldered into the board, you had to unsolder them. And the technicians that came up with the fix said the best way to unsolder them is to cut the old chips off and pull the legs out one at a time. That way you don't have to put so much heat on the motherboard to get all them legs out at one time. So I took a little pair of side cutters and I started cutting the chips off the board.
Yikes.
And people's jaws just dropped. And then I soldered all the new chips in and started it back up. And I don't know, I was the first one I know that had 512K on my Mac.
Nice.
So
Nice.
It wasn't an Atari, though.
No. They never are.
Even back then. Nope, it was not an Atari computer. And the gaming was not there.
Well, I think that's all I need, unless you have more surprises for me.
No, it was fairly cut and dry. It was, can't say enough about how great a place it was to work and how much I enjoyed it and loved it there. I wish that I could have stayed forever.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, well, I hope everything turns out well for you, and if you ever need anything I could maybe help with, feel free.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.